Doom is one of the oldest and most loved franchises of all time. For a long time, it was held up as the quintessential FPS experience, and any game that tried to step into the genre were classified as Doom clones. That is how much of an impact this franchise has made on the industry, and for many, it is still considered one of the greatest games of all time. With all that said though, I think it is time for me to admit that I am not a fan of Doom. I never really played it as a child, and now that I am a big boy with big boy problems such as really bad crippling debt and health issues that could kill me one day, I haven't really wanted to go back to check them out. I tried playing Doom 2016, and even though the soundtrack is full of absolute bangers, the fast-paced gameplay and focus on shooting things in the face with big guns never really appealed to me. I'm not saying this franchise is bad in any way, it's just not my cup of tea. So you may find it a wee bit strange, considering my stance on the franchise, that I'll be reviewing a Doom game, but not just any Doom game, but Doom 3, the black sheep of the franchise. The one many believe doesn't capture the essence of Doom, but instead has a focus on horror instead of balls to the wall action. And those reasons why some Doom fans dislike the game is exactly why I wanted to play it. I prefer a slower experience with a larger emphasis on horror and atmosphere, and from what I heard, Doom 3 did exactly that. And I think my approach and perspective may be a little bit different from others. I am not a die-hard Doom fanatic, so when analysing this game, I will not have any of the opinions and expectations associated with those who have played this series since they were young and hold it close to their heart. Now that doesn't mean I won't be comparing it to the older titles, but I won't be holding up those games as what Doom 3 should be. So here we go, a Doom 3 review from someone who doesn't play Doom. This should end well, right? Let's kick this review off with the story so we have an idea about why demons are here and why we are killing them. There will be no spoilers, but I will summarise my opinion of the overall story. But don't worry, there isn't really a story to spoil. Doom 3 is a prequel slash reboot of the franchise, so it ignores all of the plots from the previous games, which is fine by me because I had no idea that the original Doom games even had a story. Doom 3 is set on Mars in 2145, where a company known as the Union Aerospace Corporation, or UAC, has set up a scientific research facility and have started researching teleportation devices, biological research, and advanced weaponry on Mars. Anytime a large, possibly evil company in science fiction travels to another planet to research some bullshit, it always ends terribly, and Doom 3 is no different. Where other companies may accidentally stumble across an ancient alien or a hidden relic, the UAC use their teleportation technology to accidentally open the literal gate to hell. On the list of complete blunders, opening the gates to hell is up there with not opening enough registers at a supermarket and pissing off the boomers. The player character, a silent protagonist with a face that looks like a constipated potato, arrives on the station just before, well, all hell breaks loose. And once it does, he is tasked with killing as many demons as possible and closing the gates of hell. The plot of Doom 3 doesn't really do anything past this extremely simple setup. There are some extra details that can be found throughout the game, but I honestly couldn't bring myself to care enough and actually consume all of the plot. I didn't feel the urge to get lost in this world and the story id Software were trying to tell. I am not against taking my time and really analysing everything a game story has to offer, whether that be reading notes, looking at the environment, or researching the plot further once I complete the game. But Doom 3 didn't scratch that itch for me, so instead, I've had to resort to using cream 3 times a day. I was really hoping to be told an interesting and fun sci-fi horror story because that is one of my favourite subgenres of horror. But the plot takes a massive backseat after the first few levels of the game, and most of your time in Doom 3 will be going from one place to another with no narrative reason besides close the gates of hell. I recognise that is a serious goal, probably one of the biggest goals in the history of goals, but just having a clear objective isn't enough. I need more. You do meet some friendly and shady characters here and there, but none are really memorable, except for an evil scientist who talks about taking your soul and maniacally laughing at the end of every sentence.
You cannot escape.
If he was in a Dark Souls game, he would fit in perfectly. Every character is pretty much one-dimensional, and if they were replaced with a cardboard cutout with big muscles or a lab coat, they would still have the same personality. They are just there to either give the silent protagonist a new objective, mainly get them an item, or give them something. After that, they just chill in the same spot, and if the player ever comes back, that character is, well, usually dead. Though I love games that focus heavily on gameplay, I also love to be told a compelling or at least interesting story along the way to keep me invested and motivate me to continue playing. playing, especially when I'm playing a horror game. And from what I can gather, this is the first Doom game to really focus on telling a story, and in my opinion, it fails at that. I'm sure if I read all of the notes found around the game, I would have learnt a lot more about the world, the politics of the UAC, and the Mars station, but I just didn't care enough to sit down and try to engage with the narrative through those means. Doom 3's plot is so unimportant to the game that about halfway through, I completely forgot about its existence because id Software didn't write something that was memorable or enjoyable. Even the end of the game forgets the evil scientist had a role to play in the plot of this game. That is the clearest sign that Doom 3's plot is not good. Not good at all. So if the story isn't any good, I need the gameplay to bolster that up. So how is that aspect of Doom 3? Doom 3 is a Doom game. Some would say it is the third game in the franchise known as Doom, but that piece of information has never been confirmed. In Doom, you run around with an assortment of big manly men guns and shoot demons in the face. It is honestly as simple as that. As I said before, I won't be comparing this game to the other titles in the franchise too often, but Doom 3 is more horror focused. So let me tell you how this went. Judging on what little gameplay I've seen of the older games and the hour I played of 2016, Doom 3 is a much slower and linear experience. Unlike other entries in the franchise where the player would run around like a steroid needle on steroids and killing demons in somewhat large areas which complemented the movement speed, Doom 3 is set, for the most part, entirely on a facility. So that means lots of corridors and small rooms. Because of this, the speed of the player had to be slowed down because the level design and setting don't really mix well with fast movement. This decision could have also been made because Doom 3 was intended to be a more horror experience, and with horror, you don't want the player to be bolting around because that doesn't really mix well when the developer is trying to evoke a certain atmosphere or trying to scare the player. If you speed past everything in a horror game, you won't be able to experience everything the developer created. The other key aspect of Doom is the guns, and I've got to say, these guns really suck. Their designs look really chunky and kind of boring. I can't really tell whether this is because of how the engine models objects, but everything just looks really big and angled. You get a pistol, assault rifle, shotgun, plasma rifle, minigun, rocket launcher, and a few others. The most memorable sci-fi guns look really cool. Think of the pulse rifle from Aliens or the plasma cutter from Dead Space. Each of these designs looks cool but also practical, like the people who created them thought about how people in this world would use them, how they would operate, and how people in this world would design their weapons. In Doom 3, every gun is a big chunky man because you play as a big chunky man, and I am not the biggest fan of that kind of design. I wouldn't care as much about how the guns look if when you actually fired them, they sounded powerful, but nearly every gun in Doom 3 sounds so underwhelming. The assault rifle sounds like it's shooting out Nerf gun rounds. The shotgun sounds as though someone recorded a shotgun from 20 kilometers away. And the plasma rifle and BFG sound like someone is making laser noises with their mouth. It literally just sounds like p'too 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 or like that's the guns in this game. The only weapon that sounds anywhere near appropriate is the chainsaw, and honestly that is the best weapon in the game. But every other weapon in a franchise about big beefy guns sounds like the audio representation of a sad, pathetic man who has bought a fancy car to attract women. I never felt like I was wielding a powerful arsenal of weapons, and in a game where you shoot stuff a lot, nailing the feeling and sound of the guns is one of the most important parts of a first-person shooter. Though Doom 3 is a departure from the older games, it still takes design influences from those titles. A lot of the time in Doom 3, you will be exploring and you will run into a locked door that can only be opened with the appropriate security clearance. In the older games, that was fine, because they felt kind of arcadey. But for some reason, I feel like this really breaks the flow of Doom 3. Not because of their sheer existence, but because how often this obstacle is used. Nearly every level has several doors that require security clearance, and these levels are in no way long. So what could have been a small nuisance becomes a regular annoyance very quickly. If these obstacles were just halved, the flow of exploration could have been so much smoother. I really did enjoy exploring the Mars facility, but having these constant roadblocks that do not involve any sort of problem solving beyond find the PDA wasn't interesting. If Doom 3 had some more unique or varied methods of progressing, it wouldn't have felt so repetitive. But it doesn't, so it feels repetitive. Where Doom 3 does offer some variety is in the enemies the player will encounter. Since we are fighting demons that come come from hell, the developers got to have a little fun and experiment with their designs and how these enemies would operate. You will encounter zombies who either attack you with a melee weapon or shoot you, imps who shoot fireballs, revenants who are like skeleton things with rocket launchers on their shoulders, the Pinky, which is a big old fat boy, and the Hell Knight, who has a brutal melee attack and a long range attack. There are many more enemies, but you get the idea. Lots of enemies. Good. I really appreciate how much time and effort went into their variety, and when you encounter several types at once, things can get pretty hectic. The massive problem with the enemies in Doom 3 is they die so easily. I was playing on normal difficulty, so I expected at least a challenge, but every enemy died in a couple of shots. Enemies like the Pinky, who had an awesome introduction that would make them out to be this like formidable foe, die so quickly. It just takes a couple of shots. Every enemy that's introduced is like this. You'll see the new enemy, you're like, oh damn, shit's about to go down, look at this bad guy, and then like a second later, they're dead because you shot them once. This left me with a feeling of complete disappointment. I was led to believe by Bible thumpers that demons were supposed to be this terrifying and dangerous thing, but they lied, which honestly, it isn't a surprise. Their complete and utter weakness kind of broke my suspension of disbelief when it comes to how much of a threat they really were. If I can kill most of these demons with a few pistol shots, why can't everyone else in this facility? Why is everyone dying? A light breeze could kill Hell's army. Even the bosses, who are meant to be the toughest enemies in the game, die so easily. Like, laughably easily. None of them were difficult in any way, and I was honestly gobsmacked by how much of a cakewalk each boss fight was. The only enemy that is super dangerous is one you encounter very early on in the game, and honestly, it's the most unexpected enemy to be a really big pain in the ass. That enemy is the zombies with guns. These guys will fuck your day up in an instant. Since the other enemies have to either get up close or they shoot you with slow projectiles, they are super easy to avoid. But because bullets are bullets and bullets are fast, these asshats just pop out of nowhere like fucking commando roll out of nowhere and shoot you several times before you've even had a chance to fire a single round. Big demons have nothing on a walking corpse with a shotgun. Doom 3 is such an easy game. I'm sure if I bumped up the difficulty, I would have had a more challenging experience, but on the standard difficulty, which I honestly believe that most people would have started with, Doom 3 is a mind-numbingly easy title that rarely offers a challenge. This kind of makes more sense in the older Doom games because you're running around at lightning speeds and blasting loads of enemies, which matches that kind of style of the game, very arcadey. But in what is intended to be a slower, scarier experience, having super easy enemies takes away from how scary and threatening they are. Speaking of scary, Doom 3 was advertised as a horror game, so let me talk about that. When I started Doom 3, I was immediately taken aback by the atmosphere. The Mars station was creepy, and this is going to sound weird, but it was also cold. What I mean by that is I felt like neither a person or the station cared about whether I lived or died. They were all there for a sinister, shadowy purpose, and my survival was not really a concern. You can hear several NPCs talking about how people have gone missing, while others will tell you to just leave, which really added to that feeling of dread.
I'm getting off this rock, and you should too. If you're staying here, watch your back.
Like something bad was happening here, but also something worse was going to happen. The station itself is metallic and dark. Each location in it feels somewhat sinister and eerie. Everything just feels so synthetic and not human. One great thing about the game is how well the graphics have aged. Well, at least when it comes to the environment. The textures, don't look very good. I played the BFG edition, which had a little graphical boost, and the world of Doom 3 really looks good considering how old it is. But the character models look like potatoes and are repeated so often. You will run into the same three guys over and over and over again, and it makes you remember you are in a game, which does a disservice to the atmosphere. What really makes Doom's atmosphere amazing is the use of lighting. The id Tech 4 engine was designed to provide unified lighting and shadows, which meant that the light sources were created in real time and allowed shadows and lighting to exist exist more realistically in the game. At the time, this was amazing, and even today, the id Tech 4 engine does an amazing job with fully utilizing lights, darkness, and shadows. Great use of lighting can really make a horror experience that much more terrifying, and how it is used in the environments in Doom 3 is perfectly done. Where Doom 3's new horror angle truly shines is when the gates of hell first open up. Before that, you are forced to wander around the station with no guns. So straight up, playing a part of Doom with no guns shows how the developers' intentions have changed. You get to explore the station, soak in the atmosphere, watch some advertisements, and get a feeling of what day-to-day life is like for those living here. Interact with some other people living and working there as well. As I mentioned before, people generally tell you this place is a shithole and something is wrong, but you never really get that much information about what exactly is going on. But I like that, because it lets your imagination fill in the blanks. Your goal here is that you have to report to your higher up, and once you do, you are told to retrieve a scientist in a mine. This is when you gain access to your pistol, but nothing really has provoked you enough to use it. Well, something does soon. You meet the scientist who tells you they have been up to some shady shit. The lights go out and the emergency sirens start to blare. Out of nowhere, these skulls engulfed in flames come out, and one of them hits the scientist, turning him into a zombie. You pop a cap in his ass, and honestly, I sound so white saying that, and then you have to try to get back to the station. But what I love about this section is the atmosphere that is created, well, when hell breaks loose. You don't get to really see what's going on. You run into a monster here and there, but this part is dedicated to making you fear what is to come. This is an auditory explosion of screams, begs for help, and death. The lighting also does a really good job at accentuating the chaos. It was my favorite instance of horror in Doom 3 because the developers showed restraint. Seeing something brutal or horrific does not allow your mind to fill in the blanks. You see the horror, so you know the horror. It held back and only let you hear what is going on. No one screams, "This monster is ripping my arm off!" They just scream for their lives and then they stop. And you have to imagine why they stopped screaming. When I was playing this part, I felt more uneasy hearing the horrors instead of seeing it. I always believe great audio is essential for a great horror experience, and this section of Doom 3, in my opinion, is one of the best examples of that technique. Another part of the new horror angle used in Doom 3 was when hell entered the real world. There are several moments throughout the game where you'll just be walking around, minding your own business, when some creepy bullshit starts happening on your screen. You will hear screams, maybe some blood will appear out of nowhere, and you see some horrific imagery. These moments are used sparingly, but are also used when I least expected it. Hands down, some of the coolest moments in this game. But my favorite moment of just sheer horror is when you finally get to go to hell in the later part of the game. If you don't want to hear about this part because it might spoil it for you, just skip to this time code here. Don't worry, I'll be back. Are they gone? Good, because those guys fucking suck. Hell is where id got to go a bit crazy with the level design. They weren't confined to the logistical layout of a scientific facility. They got to stretch their creative legs and have some fun. Hell is just a damn cool place to explore. Walls split apart, revealing new areas, walkways fall apart, and you have to carefully navigate them, otherwise you'll fall into a pit of lava. You get to see brutal imagery and the massive monuments and buildings created to instill fear and terror on those who come here. Fire and lava consume nearly every area, and it just feels like you don't want to stick around for too long because it's hell, and hell isn't really a fun place to be. But as someone playing a game and loves horror, it is an awesome place to explore. It is just like a heavy metal album cover personified. My only gripes are aspects of the design that are repeated here, which I will get into later, and your time in hell is short and sweet. I can see the design decision behind this. You don't want the player to get comfortable in this location because that would take away from it. But I just wanted to spend a little bit more time in hell because it was an awesome change of pace from a visual standpoint. Hell is easily the best level of the entire game, and when it was over and I was taken back to the dreary facility, all I wanted to do was go back. But where the horror of Doom 3 tends to fall apart is that it can't sustain the atmosphere it establishes in the early part of the game, and instead of trying to stick to the new horror angle it so desperately wants to focus on, it just turns into Doom, but if someone turned off the lights. The early half of the game does a really decent job at keeping horror at the forefront. It's not exactly scary, but some moments are atmospheric and creepy. Monsters are pretty prevalent, but their numbers seem somewhat held back, and I believe that is a deliberate decision to maintain the focus on horror. The world itself is pretty creepy, abandoned, lifeless, and just empty, but it doesn't do anything new with this. It's always exploring the same locations, doing the same thing. Nothing new happens in this game. No new scenarios or anything like that. And once you get used to this, the horror just kind of disappears. It just becomes you walking around this empty facility shooting demons in the face. And if the demons did something interesting to maybe spice things up, maintaining atmosphere is one of the hardest things that you can do. Maintaining this feeling of dread is one of the hardest things you can do. Maintain a feeling of unease is one of the hardest things things you can do. But many developers who, create horror games know this, so they try to keep the player on edge at all times, but also keep it unpredictable, and Doom just gets predictable. I think the main examples of how Doom is so predictable is how the encounters of monsters are actually executed. It isn't very great, and that comes down to two major things: visual and audio sound cues, and monster cupboards. We will start with the visual and audio cues. Other horror games such as Silent Hill, Dead Space, Resident Evil, you name it, use visual and audio cues in such a way that lets you know an enemy is nearby, but doesn't exactly tell you where. Again, your mind starts filling in the blanks. And sometimes those cues trick you, as nothing ever appears, which in my opinion is the scariest usage of such a technique. Think of Silent Hill's radio or Dead Space's creaky spaceship. Doom 3 seems to understand that, but it utilizes it so poorly. Besides the occasional jump scare when the player opens the door and a monster jumps forward, which happens too much in this game and it gets boring really quick, you always know when and where a monster is coming. How exactly? Well, you will hear an explosion kind of noise and see the floor light up with red, followed by what I assume is like lightning, and a monster will appear. This whole ordeal takes a few seconds, so it does take away from the surprise in such a big way. I may not know what monster I'm about to face, but I know they are coming, so before they even have a chance to take one step, I hack them to death with my chainsaw and just move on to the next one. Doom 3 continues to tell players exactly when and where monsters are going to appear by the overabundant usage of monster closets. Doom 3 absolutely loves monster closets. If it was physically possible, I believe id Software would marry monster closets and have little monster closet babies and start a whole generation of monster closets. That joke was terrible, I know, but I'm keeping it in. But what is a monster closet? Well, it's this. It is just a room with a few walls that just so happens to feature little closets behind doors that perfectly fit monsters from hell. I have honestly begun to believe the architect who designed this facility was working for Satan. Also, just a little side note, why are demons hiding inside these closets? Did they all just walk into this room and accidentally open the closets and all had like a simultaneous eureka moment? I don't know, but ignoring all of that, monster closets are lazy. You walk into a room and know exactly what's going to happen because you've done it so many times. So you just walk in and wait for the doors to open and the hide and seek demons pop out and try to kill you. But since the game is easy and you know what the fuck's going on, you kill them without breaking a sweat and just move on. Doom uses these so much, and I am surprised no one sat down with the person who suggested the idea and just went, hey, are you okay? But these two examples speak to the overall problem with Doom 3 has with being a horror game. It is super predictable. The so-called scares and how they implemented are blatantly shown to you in the start of the game, and they don't change too much throughout the rest of the game. I know this may sound stupid, but Doom 3 feels like the most gamey horror game I've ever played. Just let me explain. Because it is so predictable, I stopped seeing the world of Doom as an experience and instead saw it as a game designed by a team of people. I knew exactly what I was about to encounter because it was laid out exactly the same as all the previous levels. If it's slightly open, you're going to see lights and monsters appear. Is it a room that goes nowhere but an item is conveniently placed right at the end? It's a monster closet. The game does spice things up occasionally. These moments are so scarce that when I did encounter them, I thought I was playing a different game. The biggest nail in the coffin for the new horror angle of Doom 3 is that once the game barely passes the halfway mark, id decided to abandon any semblance of maintaining the horror angle it so desperately wanted to focus on. Instead, I think they were worried about alienating their hardcore fans, or they had no idea how to maintain the horror. So instead of sticking to their vision, they hastily tried to make Doom 3 just like all the old Doom games. So that means a fuckload of enemies and constant action. Nearly each room contains at least 5 to 10 enemies, and they all come in waves. This is repeated in nearly every single room until the credits roll. But because this new gameplay style is trying to gel within the confines of the horror atmosphere they try to create, and the gameplay changes they made to accommodate that, it just doesn't fit in. You are still running through the same location locations, doing the same shit, but now you don't feel any sense of unease or dread because the game isn't trying to do that anymore. You are just shooting stuff. And I know that at its core, if we just boil this down to the pure fundamentals, that is what Doom is about. But id doesn't capture anything about what made those older games fun. So it just turns into a boring, slightly average shooter that for some reason is set in a horror locale. Because of all the mechanics and environmental designs I've mentioned earlier that were used to create a horror experience, Doom 3 ends up feeling like a slow Doom clone. And that is why I subtitled this video as an identity crisis. Doom 3 doesn't know whether it wants to be a horror game or a Doom game, so it ends up being a poor version of both. And I honestly think this is because it is the third entry in one of the most popular franchises of all time, and such a departure from the core design of the series would upset fans, so they decided to try and make it more of a horror game, but also a Doom game. A game without an identity always ends up displeasing both fans and people new to the series but enjoy horror games such as myself. The Doom fans are disappointed because it feels like a poor man's version of Doom, and horror fans are disappointed because it feels like a boring horror game. Though I absolutely love Resident Evil 6, that game did the same thing. It tried to please everyone and only please people who love dumb and bombastic action games. Id needed to commit to one or the other, or if they wanted to create a horror game, they should have just done that. Make a new game because there wouldn't be any expectation from fans. Doom 3 is the first Doom game I have ever completed, and honestly, it will probably be the last one as well. As I said, I'm not into Doom, but I wanted to give this game a go because it looked like an interesting horror game. But all I played was a below average Doom game with dark lighting, jump scares, and monster closets. The early part of the game where they established the atmosphere and some other moments showed me glimpses of what could have been a great horror game. But I just wish Doom 3 wasn't a Doom game because I believe that is what truly holds this game back. I now know why it is dubbed the black sheep of the franchise by fans. It isn't a bad game, but it isn't a good game. It isn't a Doom game, but it isn't a horror game. It's this average shooter that tries to scare you every now and again.